This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com, and today I have a Northeast independent wrestling legend, former star, and was in the office of the National Wrestling Federation that was one of the top independents of the early 90s. And he was an ECW original as well as a tri-state wrestling wrestler. DC Drake, how are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm good, Hannibal. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I understand you also have a psychology degree, which is kind of rare for a professional wrestler, at least of your era.
Well, I do. I actually started out working in law enforcement in the state of New Jersey, but I always loved wrestling. I mean, that goes way back to my childhood. Um, but in working in law enforcement, one of the things I witnessed was the amount of people that were incarcerated because of drugs and addiction. So that's really where my focus was. I got my degree in psychology, masters, and I ended up working in a number of different programs. And my last before I retired from that kind of work was at Shattuck Hospital in Boston, where I was a director of treatment there for those older adults with HIV/AIDS, plus a lengthy history of addiction and mental health.
Very interesting. And I did hear you say in another interview that one of the reasons you didn't last in ECW was because of the drug and alcohol use you were seeing in the back in those days. Is that true?
Oh yeah, that's very true. And again, without naming names, and they only did one show with them. And although I was in talks with them for a long time, the show I did it was with I worked with Cactus Jack. And the name, I think the name of the show, they titled it Return of the Funker. And that's the one where Terry Funk came out of the dumpster during a match with Cactus Jack. As I was sitting in the back in the locker room, the smell of pot and the alcohol, it just wasn't, first of all, I don't drink and I'm not into that kind of behavior. But secondly, the fact that the work I did, it certainly wasn't a place I wanted to be. So, yeah, that was it. I was one night, and that was it. Even though Paul asked me if I wanted to do a program with Tommy Dreamer, what I saw, just my heart wasn't in it, and so I never went back.
I understand Woman was involved in that match, managing Mick Foley. Of course, she passed away at the hands of Chris Benoit years later. Did you have much interaction with her?
I mean, I had some. I worked. He worked as a manager for me when I was with Tri-State Wrestling Alliance. I was their champion for probably close to a year, maybe a little over a year, and I had her by my side during that time. I had known her for some previous work I did with Savoldi's and as well as the National Wrestling Federation. So I was familiar with her. And again, our discussions, our talks were basically about anything but wrestling. And I knew in speaking with her that there were some problems in her life, and it was kind of unfortunate things ended up the way they did.
Yeah, we don't hear much about how she was in real life, other than, of course, uh, formerly being married to Kevin Sullivan, and then I guess I guess she didn't really leave him for Chris Benoit. I guess they were already separated at that point. But you're saying she was a pretty normal person overall in your experience?
Again, my feeling was, and I try not to look at everything in the eyes of a psychologist, but she didn't really seem to be a very happy person on the inside, even then. And you look at the fact that she got involved in the business at a very young age, and I'm sure that took a lot out of her. You really become hardened. You really put the walls in place, and that's how I view Nancy. Uh, I think wrestling ruined her, but I think having a kid helped bring her back to some reality. But getting involved at such a young age, that's certainly not something good. Especially during that era.
Is one of the reasons you left wrestling being a psychologist, and obviously, like I've been in the wrestling business. I know what it's like, especially more closer to the early 2000s, which kind of overlapped the 90s a bit, there was a lot of people with issues, and it was kind of encouraged to have those issues where you wouldn't fit in or necessarily be one of the boys. Was it just too hard to be around that type of environment as a psychologist?
No, I mean, probably the number one reason I left wrestling was just being on the road. Now, growing up, my first interaction with wrestling was with my grandmother. This is probably going back to maybe the early 1960s. As a kid, walking into her house and seeing her sit in front of the TV, and I think the matches were coming out of Chicago at that point. And here was my grandmother, a person that I loved dearly, very quiet, very subdued. But boy, when wrestling was on, she went crazy. And I often wondered as a kid, what was it about that? And then I went to the first match with my father and my uncle, and I was hooked on it at that point. I was probably 6 or 7. But wrestling, I really loved it. I really wanted to become a wrestler. And then when I got on into the business and the amount of time spent on the road and some of the, again, that part of the behaviors I saw, that was another issue. Yeah, it really turned out to be something that, as much as I loved it, I really couldn't be around it too much longer.
This is kind of a conspiracy theorist question, but I'll put it up anyways.
Yeah,
Ahmed is asking if you think that Chris really committed those murders of his wife and kid.
I honestly don't think about that. It depends on who's doing the talking. So a lot of the people I see in wrestling and the fans, if they, a lot of times they mix up real life with the fantasy of pro wrestling. And I think that happens a lot with the people that follow this. They don't want to believe that Chris Benoit was capable of this, and therefore they're going to look for reasons as to why in their mind they can prove that it wasn't him. But all the evidence points towards him, and I don't care what excuse you use, whether it's CTE or drug use or drinking. The fact is, I do believe he did it. I don't see any conspiracies here. And again, what would the conspiracy be? I know Kevin got pulled into it, but I think Kevin's a little bit too smart for that, and especially given the amount of time that they were apart and the issues that the two of them had. I just think it happened, and no conspiracy.
Did you have much interaction with Kevin over the years? I know he was in the Northeast quite a bit.
Yeah, I worked with Kevin a few times with Savoldi before he took on the Mad Dog character. And again, it was a pleasure. I learned from Kevin just those couple of matches. I learned a lot from Kevin. It was right at the beginning of my career, so I never had any issues with Kevin, and I actually looked up to him a lot. The character itself that they had, the Mad Dog character, I actually based it, I guess, on a couple of different people. Kevin was one of them, and King Curtis was the other. And King Curtis especially, she scared the crap out of me when I was a kid, and that's what I wanted. That's the kind of character I wanted. To go out there and have people look at me and wonder what the heck's going on with this guy. So I know what it did to me. I know how my friends felt about him, and so those were the two guys I tried a little bit the basic character upon, and then of course I added my own touches.
And of course, for the younger fans, King Curtis was involved in the Dungeon of Doom in WCW with Kevin Sullivan in more recent years. I think he died of some type of blood infection. I think
Mm,
fairly young, like a lot of the wrestlers die young.
yeah, you know what? I used to do the phone from the mouth gimmick, and that was one of the things that scared the crap out of me. I guess I was probably, I think it was with WWF or WWF at the time, and he started doing the phone from the mouth gimmick. And for the life of me at that time, at my age, I had no idea how he was doing it. So I would spend my time as a kid wondering, where does this guy live? What does he do? Does he really have him locked up somewhere? It was that mystique and that wonder that really made wrestling something for me and for other people too. Like a magician. You give away the trick, it's not fun anymore. But in those days when you didn't know, boy, it was great to just wonder what that was all about.
And I understand you grew up in Philadelphia. We have a lot of international fans that watch this channel, and of course, a lot of Canadian fans. We always see movies about Philadelphia of how rough and tough it is. What's it really like growing up there?
I mean, I grew up in a town just a little bit north of Philadelphia, but I mean, it's like any other city. I don't, I didn't hang out on the street. I'll put it that way. So I did not really saw a lot of that. Um, Philly has a mystique about it, and in fact, the whole eastern part of Pennsylvania was really a hotbed of pro wrestling. Allentown, Hamburg, that's where Vince was doing his shows out of initially. Um, the Philadelphia Arena is where he taped the show early on, and then moved that into the Allentown Fairgrounds. Bruno opened up a company, I think that was in Allentown, that they wrestled at one of the hotels up there. So that whole area, the whole eastern Pennsylvania area, was a hotbed of pro wrestling back in the days when I grew up.
And obviously, it still is. They were just breaking records with WrestleMania in Philadelphia last month, I believe. So it's still a hotbed. What are your first memories of going to wrestling? I know Bruno Sammartino was one of your favorites growing up.
Oh yeah, I mean he was it certainly was an idol of mine. My first, again, I think I told you, I said it earlier. I remember going to visit my grandmother when wrestling was on, and my grandmother, when I knew her most of the time, she was quiet, unassuming. But the four-letter words that would come out of her mouth when wrestling was on amazed me. In fact, it shocked me that my grandmother that they could do that to my grandmother. And this is going back in the days before they had cable TV. So she had the antenna on her roof. So if it was a windy night or it was raining, the reception would be bad. And just when something good was about to happen or the bad guy was getting his comeuppance, so to speak, it would go to snow. And my grandmother would kick the couch and throw the chair. My grandfather would get a kick out of it. And I'm sitting there as a little kid, maybe, I guess I was about 6 or 7, wondering, what was this all about? Probably in the mid 60s, my father and my uncle took me to see a show at a local armory. And it was the same thing. I mean, you walk into place and you got to sit down, you got to watch this, everybody was talking. And back in those days, again, Hannibal, when you went to a wrestling match, it was like going to a church. Everybody showed up with ties on. Women were dressed nice. There was smoking, of course. Everybody was smoking. So you're in this environment with smoke and heat and sweat. People dressed like they're going to church, and then you had these 2 or 3, 300-pound guys in the ring throwing each other around. It was scary, but at the same time, it was fascinating, and that's really what hooked me. And after that, when I first began to drive, this is going back to '73, I guess it was. I started making the trek every 3 weeks to the Philadelphia Arena. And again, you walk into the place, and this is the thing I think a lot of fans, younger fans, don't experience today. But it could have been just me. But you walk in and you smell the cigars, you can smell the smoke, you can smell the liniment, you can smell the hot dog. The humidity in these places was sticky. But there was a special environment with pro wrestling in those days that when you walked in and you had that environment there and you're sitting there, you knew you were part of wrestling. And it was just, today the arena is just so sterile. You don't smell anything, you don't see anything, you're way up, away from the ring. In those days, you were 2 feet from the ring. You could touch it. And younger people who are fans, they really don't have that experience. But there's just something about it that can't be explained from my end. I can't fully explain it, but I know it was special.
And the other thing is that's different is I think the suspension of disbelief isn't there as much. People are going into it more accepting it as a show than being able to like buy into it as much, hating the heels and cheering the faces I've found at events.
Well, even at the age when I was younger, even when I was a young teenager, I certainly knew it wasn't all real. But you were able to suspend disbelief because you didn't see everything. No one told you about everything. Just when you thought you saw something that would make it fake, and I use that word, a lot of people use it in those days. you would see something that would bring it back again. That you could say, you know what, this is something special. And like I said, it's like going to see a magician. Once you know what that trick is all about, you don't want to see it again. It's not fun anymore. And that's one of the things I think the fans miss out on. You can't let go of that at the door. And today, a lot of the fans today, they actually think that, and I don't want to badmouth them, but they actually want to be part of the show on the outside. They don't want to just go and enjoy themselves. I mean, you see them on Facebook, you see them on some of the other social media. They all have better ideas. They all have better thoughts. They know how to run the show better. Um, and again, it's because of what's out there about wrestling today. You know, and the fact that promoters actually respond to some of these wishes that people have make it even worse. Now, some could say, well, you know, it's a wonderful thing that fans can actually do that and be a part of it. But I don't think it is, especially for what pro wrestling used to be and what it meant. You know, when I was a kid, my father was disabled, so I didn't really have him in my life the way I wanted to have him. You know, he wasn't able to show up at baseball games I played. He wasn't able to show up at special school meetings or any kind of school productions that were going on. But I had Bruno Sammartino, who reminded me of my father. You know, so the fact that you could actually have a wrestler to look up to, and he actually meant some, from a psychological standpoint, actually meant something to the fans. He stood for good. He won. He won over evil. Now, yes, we know. Again, I think he even knew at that age that it wasn't always 100% legit. But the fact was that it meant something to me and to other fans because we could look at that man as representing something for us. You know that good will always overcome evil. It may not in the beginning. You know, it may not. You know, in the middle, but at the end, if you do the right thing, you're going to be rewarded, and that's what wrestling meant. You always had that special story, you know, and you always knew that in the end, good would triumph.
I heard that Bruno Sammartino was so dedicated to keeping his image, he wouldn't even drink if there was kids around because he didn't want to let kids see him drinking even wine or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that too. And what can you say about something like that? He knew what wrestling meant to people, and so he lived out that piece for people. Today, you know, a lot of these guys take drinking and the stuff they do is actually a badge of courage. They brag about it. And again, certainly, if I were a kid and Bruno would come on TV and talk about, you know, having 10 women in one night and being drunk, I certainly would not have that kind of, I wouldn't idolize him the way I did.
Yeah, I heard Bruno say about Ric Flair that, yeah, he's a great wrestling champion, but this is before all these stories came out publicly about him. He was going into bars, flashing people with his robe off and everything. I mean, it's not the same. The champion isn't as respected if he's seen doing that kind of stuff. And Bruno kept his image very respectable and role modelish over the years. So good for him that he kept that all the way up to his death.
Yeah, and again, the stuff that Ric Flair did and the stuff that Ric Flair brags about certainly ruins his legacy and his image.
Honestly, I used to look up to Ric Flair, and I've behaved like him at various times in my life. And only in recent years did I realize, boy, was that a terrible role model to have. But hopefully, not everyone follows him as closely as I did. But as far as you as a promoter, how did you get into the promoting side of wrestling?
Well, one of the goals I had in living in the eastern Pennsylvania area, I actually wanted, to be honest with you, Hannibal, I would have been very happy behind the scenes and not ever going out into the ring as long as I could put together the shows. That's what I enjoyed more than anything else. And we started. I started with a gentleman named the Concrete Cowboy in Pennsylvania. He was outside of Philly, and we put our heads together and we come up with an organization we called the Continental Wrestling Alliance. I know there was one. Lawler had one. I think he was association. I'm not sure. Anyway, we started running shows at the VFW in Pennsylvania and Easton. Then I got a local TV station involved, and they started doing our tapings. And those were the days, again, as a promoter, where I would have to get the dates. I would actually physically run them around to different TV stations. I would have to put the posters up. And I know I've seen some of your videos where you do that same kind of work. I know I heard you say that you were driving to Edmonton or one of the shows that you spent a day there putting up posters and hitting the town. That's what we did. That was the way that you promoted the show years ago. That hard legwork is what made things work for people. And again, those posters, there's something special about the old wrestling posters too. And so I wanted to put together an organization. What I wanted to do was have our guys build around some of the names I would bring in. And it just got to the point where I was running out of money. And then another gentleman named Robert Raskin, who was a very nice guy, very honest man too. When it comes to pro wrestling, to have an honest promoter, it's kind of rare. But he came in, and then he took over the financial end of things, and I started doing the booking. I still kept doing marketing for him, and I climbed back in the ring again, and I became the champion. We then went to become the National Wrestling Alliance. I became the champion of that. Now again, let's put that into context. When I was a champion for them, yes, it was an honor, but I was also the booker, and I hear people talk about that. But also to remember that if we put the belt on a Sergeant Slaughter, or we put a belt on uh, Superstar Billy Graham, who worked for us at times, he was working for other people too, and there were chances he may not show up. So at least me being there all the time, being a champion was that a necessity more than it was that an ego. I was always there, and I would always show up. And so holding that, holding the belt was more of a necessity than it was of anything else. There's certainly, yeah, there's some ego. We all have ego, but it was more about making sure the business looked good and having the champion show up on the nights he was supposed to be there.
Do you recall in around 96, you may have been out of the business by then, but the NWF came here to Ottawa, Canada during the exhibition with Jules Strongbow, Wendy Richter, and Nikolai Volkov, and it was like a one-time only show. There was Jimmy Snuka was on the show too against the Metal Maniac, but it was very random, like NWF coming to Ottawa, Canada.
Yeah,
Do you recall any of that?
I don't, but I did do Canada a few times. We did a tour. I wrestled Rick Martel. I think it was in London, Ontario, and then we spent 2 weeks out in Saskatoon. Does that sound right? Saskatchewan.
Saskatoon, yeah, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, yeah,
Yeah, it
second
was.
biggest city.
Yeah, it was very much prairie out there. I remember that it was very flat, and we spent almost 2 weeks there, running a small town. So I was in Canada, and I enjoyed it. But '96, at that point, yeah, I was gone.
Very interesting. As far as the NWF, there's a famous promo of Billy Graham being interviewed by Paul Heyman from the NWF. So obviously, you already mentioned you used him. I know you wrestled him. What was your experience wrestling superstar Billy Graham, who was winding it down by that point?
He was, and I worked with him a couple of times at state fairs. And the thing that stands out most in my mind, and Graham was one heck of a nice guy. And we were getting ready for the match. We were sitting back there talking about it, and he looked at me. He said, "And my gimmick was Mad Dog." He looked at me. He said, "Dog, please don't knock me down." And I looked at him, and I understood what he meant, and I felt bad that this man had to still be in the ring when his hips were bad, his knees were bad. And that's one of the things I never wanted to do, was to make somebody who made a living off of wrestling look bad. I can't think of how many times as a champion I actually went over with anybody. When they come in, it was usually DQ or some other kind of finish. But I never wanted to put myself over, with these guys that's all they had for a living. I had something else. And I remember the look on Billy's face when he looked at me and said that, and I said, "Geez, when I reach his age, will I still be doing the same thing and asking somebody not to knock me down, not to hurt me?" And yeah, it was a very easy match, very good to work with. But I knew in those days, like you said, he was winding it down. And I think it was out of necessity more than anything else.
Yeah, I don't think he wrestled too much into the 90s, so those may have been some of his last matches. But as far as you mentioned how nice he is, sometimes he's misunderstood because understandably he was bitter towards the end. Obviously, he sees how much guys are making now. In his day, it was 5,000 to main event Madison Square Garden, and he didn't save his money well, and he didn't always have the best relationship. But in my experience with him, he didn't have an ego at all for all of his accomplishments. How would you compare him to some of the other wrestling talent, which I'm sure as a promoter you've experienced all types, and some of them definitely do have egos.
Oh yeah, some of them do, and I think from my the way I handled it from my end was again understanding and respecting where they were coming from, and it was always a tap dance to Hannibal. You know, if you said something to somebody, were they going to blow off the next match because they could go someplace else? So it was always about appeasing some of these egos. But I don't think I ever had anybody that was so bad that we didn't use anymore. Slaughter, almost the whole summer, I think it was '87. I worked with him at state fairs, and again, no issues with him. Stronghold was great to work with. Brody was not a problem to work with. We started building an angle with Brody. We started in Bricktown, and we had it on our TV show. It ended up it was a tag match with myself and Damien Kane, who was my manager at the time, against Strongbow and Bruiser Brody. And so it was getting to the point, you know, in the cage match where we double teamed Brody. I started beating him over the head with my wrestling boot, and we were going to come back and do a series of matches with him um, after that night. Unfortunately, you know, I was sitting in a TV studio probably 2 weeks later editing the tape with the producer, and I got the call that Brody was stabbed. So it was unfortunate that you know we never had a chance to follow through to work with him. But even more unfortunate that we lost him. So yeah, it was a sad day.
I know, well, you had some experience with Brody, but I think it's misunderstood sometimes that they think that he was a heel and he was feuding with Gonzalez at the time of his death, but they were both actually baby faces. That's why they were both in the same dressing rooms. Did he ever talk to you about give you any clue that there might be something unusual going on in Puerto Rico at the time? Because we've also heard there may have been money issues involved with the office, which was notorious there for having pay issues with wrestlers.
No, I never discussed that with him. In fact, I remember I was with Brody. We were in Dallas area, I think, and I drove him somewhere. I don't remember now. I was driving. It was him. I had somebody else in the back seat, and we had a nice. One of the things I tried to do when I was with these guys in the car was have discussions about other things in life and not about wrestling. And we had a long discussion about finances. And it wasn't about. It was not about wrestling finance. It was about finances in general. It was about investing your money wisely. He talked about his investments and the things he was investing in. So he was a smart man on top of that. But one of the things I always try to do, Hannibal, is not discuss the business when I was in a car with people because I didn't want to be one trick pony, and I didn't want these guys to be either. You know, there's a real life out there, and I wanted to try to bring that out in them.
Not to mention that gets you in trouble because people take mince your words and spread it around in the dressing rooms and so forth in wrestling. But I heard another interview with you discussing Bruiser Brody where unknowingly on a show you were involved with, he had fought into an area where there was a bunch of people with disabilities, and then he came out
Mm.
later to apologize and spent time with these people. Could you share that tale for us?
Yeah, that was actually, I think it was at the Ohio State Fair. It was him and Abby, and they had gotten into their usual thing around the ring, and they got into an area where they had a bunch of people in wheelchairs and other disabilities, and unbeknownst to him and Abby, that you know they couldn't run out of the way; they were stuck. So the a couple of people that were with them came to me and said, "Hey, listen, you know, it was really scary. A lot of our guys are really scared. You know, can you come talk to them?" said, you know what, I'm going to go talk to Bruiser, see if he'll come out. And he did. And he spent time with him. So that was the other side of Frank.
And of course, we mentioned the interview with Paul Heyman and superstar Billy Graham. I guess before ECW existed and probably before the tri-state took off, he was working for NWF. What were your experiences with Paul Heyman at that time?
Well, again, Paul was Paul, and if you know Paul, you know what I mean. We brought him in initially as our announcer, and he did a really good job. He was an excellent announcer. And then he decided he wanted to also get in the ring, so then he became the manager, Paulie Dangerously. So I remember we were in, I think it was in Albany, New York, when he came to me and said, hey, listen, he said, I got a chance to go down to WCW. Is that okay with you? Well, I mean, I was glad he asked me, but I know if I said no, he still would have went. But I said, yeah, sure. And the only issue I have, and I'm going to say this without looking for any kind of lawsuit, was at the same time that was happening, we had just signed an agreement with the Financial News Network. I don't know whether you remember them or not. You were probably too young. But in the United States, it was one of the first nationwide cable TV outlets, along with TBS. And they agreed to take our show. And what it was during the days, it was mostly all finance news out of Wall Street. During the weekends, they filled it with other things like infomercials and some old 1950s shows, but they also took our wrestling. And that would have been a great break for us, I think. But Paul was leaving at the same time. And I kept waiting for the show to come on. I kept saying to my partners, this is strange. They said they were going to start running us a month ago. They haven't done it yet. We called them up and they told us that they gotten a cease and desist letter from an attorney in New York saying that we could not go on because we did not have signed paperwork from the wrestlers saying that they could work the show. And so they just knocked us off. A lot of people told me that was Paul that had done that because he didn't want to be seen, doing commentary while playing Paulie Dangerously down south. So I don't know if it's true or not. I tend to believe it is, knowing Paul's personality and behaviors. But hey, maybe I would have done the same thing. So good for him, and it was up to us to try to make things work.
As far as the commissions, I've heard you in interviews talk about having to deal with commissions. How much was a pain was that? And what is your thoughts on commissions overseeing wrestling? A lot of people will say, well, it's not a real sport. We shouldn't worry about it. But there's a lot of underhanded things that happen in pro wrestling as far as wrestlers not getting paid. Sometimes beatings actually take place in matches. Sometimes people wrestle that have blood diseases. The commissions could actually regulate it to some point, but there's good and bad with commissions. What was your experience?
Well, I can tell you as a promoter, I hated them at the time because the commissions would come in, and before you even open the door for the fans, you were paying about $2,500 right off the top. We had state taxes. We had to pay for a bond for the fans and the wrestlers. Um, we had to pay for the officials. We had to pay for a ringside doctor. Um, the ring, of course, that was $500 right there. The rent the ring in those days. It was costly to open up, because of the commission. As time went along, though, I began to appreciate them being there, and especially today, being removed from the sport. Um, we used to have every year we had to be licensed, and again, I don't know whether it was like that in your area or it's still like that with you up there in Canada. But we had to have a wrestling license. We had to pass a physical. The doctor actually did a physical on you before every show. If your blood pressure was high, you weren't working. Um, in Pennsylvania, some of the commissions, there was a lot of talk about they were retirement jobs for a lot of people that were connected politically, and I'm sure that was the case. But having them there really stopped a lot of the crap that I think could have gone on. When you see what's happening today with the thumbtacks and the lights and the chairs and
Glass, yeah, the glass is terrible too, and the like construction stuff and weed whackers.
Yeah, it's crazy, and some of that stuff doesn't belong in wrestling. I mean, look at it this way: when I would go to wrestling, you'd have your opening bout. Usually, always went to a draw. Then you had your other matches, and you had the intermission. Then usually you had the main event at the end of the night. Where do where do you come back from if you have in the opening bout guys wrestling and thumbtacks and lights and like you said, weed whackers coming out? How's the next match going to top that? And how do you follow up with that? And this is why I think wrestling, especially on the independent circuit, if we had a commission, that would not happen. And it's just, yeah, I mean, you just can't get the kind of heat that you used to get years ago. And I get a kick out of reading some of the independents today. They said, "Oh, last night we had almost 100 people at the show. Like it was great." Back in when we started, 100 people wouldn't pay the bill to the commission. We had to have 500 people in place before we opened the door. So you had to work. You had to go out there and work. You had to be a promoter and you had to hustle. And and like I said, you didn't have this crap going on. You really had commissions that did something. So I hated it because of the money that you had to pay up front. But I see today where the commission is needed more than ever, especially given what's happening on the independent.
Yeah, I've driven places that but that's why I stopped doing outside independence. You drive 4 hours away, then they tell you they can only pay you half or something, or they hand you $60 and you've already gone out there. But also a lot of places in the US, I find they in Canada you need insurance to run a show at most places. In the US, they don't have insurance and they don't have medical people backstage. So it's a recipe for disaster where a
Yeah,
commission would require that.
yeah, I agree. It did require that. And yeah, we had to carry insurance too. I watch some of these glass matches that they're having, and actually see glass flying into the audience. I actually see thumbtacks flying into the audience. I see chairs hitting people. And I say, one of these days there's going to be a huge lawsuit that's going to come up, and there's going to be a cry for commissions again. And I don't know why it hasn't happened yet, because some of the stuff I see just not only dangerous for the wrestlers, it's dangerous for the people that are sitting there.
Yeah, they abolished them in Canada by saying wrestling's entertainment. But the things like the Montreal Screwjob wouldn't have happened if a commission was regulating it because it would have affected Vince's wrestling license in Montreal.
Yeah. So well, Vince was the one that actually led the charge down here in the states. He went after the New Jersey Athletic Commission, and the way he was able to get himself out of that was to try to push wrestling as entertainment, and that really blew the lid off a lot of this stuff. And again, it was all that part of wrestling. The magic was taken away just to save some money.
Now, I don't know if there was a commission this night, but Brendan wants to know about the night you wrestled a live bear in Maine.
Yeah, yeah, there was a commission there, and that was it was on one of Mario Savoldi's show. And I remember I was supposed to work with somebody. I don't remember who it was. And I'm in the back, and Mario comes back to me and he says, "Hey, kid," he says, "you want to work with a bear tonight?" So I expected, it was a wrestler named the Bear, and he said, "No, it's a real bear." So I actually teamed up with Jose Gonzalez, Invader number one. I could have used a knife that night, but we didn't do the ring. Jose says to me, "Hey, tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to get behind the bear, and then I want you to get in front and you push it down." I said, "Yeah, it sounds good to me." And again, at the time, I was about 270, bench pressing almost 600 pounds, um, military pressing 400 pounds per rep. And so we get in the ring, and the bear looked scrawny, and it was there was hair missing, it was declawed. And I said, "My God, look at this thing! And I can think I can actually take this bear." So Gonzalez gets behind, and I think he was ribbing me, but that's neither here nor there. I pushed the bear down, and that thing got so pissed. It got up, it came towards me, and I'm standing there saying, "Yeah, come on, you can't hurt me." It took its paw and it hit me in the face. Next thing you know, I woke up outside on the floor. I walked back to the dressing room, and I'm sitting there, and the owner brings the bear back, and they stop right in front of my locker where I'm sitting. Headaches, stars are going around, and the bear takes the biggest piss I've ever seen, and flooded the whole floor in front of me, including my my clothes, my gym bag. Yeah, it was an experience, and I'll promise you, I would never do that again.
Yeah, I would be interested to do it, but I don't think they would ever let anybody wrestle a bear anymore. The
No,
animal rights movements would be on them.
but they should have people rights that night because I'm telling you something. The strength that thing had, even looking like it had mange, that thing was strong. I don't think I'd ever want to do it again.
Yeah, you don't often hear very good experiences from wrestling bears. It's usually a bad experience from the wrestlers.
Yeah, it wasn't good. And again, when you're young, and I was young at the time, and certainly I wanted to impress Mario, because I wanted some more work, and then at the same time, being in the gym and pressing over 600 pounds, I felt invincible. So I figured that there is not going to do anything to me. Well, I learned a lesson that night.
How was working with Sergeant Slaughter?
Again, no problems with him. The only issue I had with him at the time, and again, this ended up being business. We did a show in Eastern Pennsylvania, and if you're a boxing fan, that's the home of Larry Holmes, who I knew because I lived in the area. And Holmes came to the show. We gave him some tickets to come to the show, and he did. And Slaughter was headlining it against the Mad Russian. And Holmes, I talked to him before the show, and he was about wanting to get involved in it. So I talked to Slaughter at the time. I said, "Listen, why don't you do something with Larry Holmes? Pick on him. It's going to get a whole lot of publicity. It's going to help us out a lot." And he said, "I can't do that." And they said, "Why?" He said, "I just can't." So later on, he knew it was kind of upset with him. And he told me he had a contract with Hasbro at the time, so doing something like that would probably get him in trouble with I think it was GI Joe he was working with at the time. So after that, I understood why he couldn't do it. But boy, it would have been a great boost for the organization and gotten us a lot of PR.
Now, you also worked with Abdullah the Butcher. I'm going to guess this may have been in the Tri-State Wrestling. How was that experience?
That was actually NWF.
Okay.
And yeah, again, no issues with Abby. As long as he got his money, he was fine. So I had like I said, no issues with him. He did what he was told to do. He sometimes got a little rough with some of the younger talent, but for the most part, he came into this job and left.
The one strange thing I'll find of knowing Abdullah as we were friends for years before we had our issue, he was always so
Right.
cheap and careful with his money, and he made so much money, yet he claims to be broke, and I just find it weird because he was never a partier. He'd eat his ice cream and his hot dogs, but it's like I wonder where all of his money went for a guy that was so cheap and always asking for extra too. I don't know if you experienced that as a promoter, but he'd
Oh
always try and get everything extra.
yeah, he did. But you're right. I mean, he was right there waiting for the paycheck. For a guy who says he can't read or write. And again, I'm not being critical of him. That's what he said. So I am being critical, I suppose. But he certainly knew how to count money, and he certainly knew when he was being shorted, or if he looked out and saw a great house asking for more, he had no problem doing that. So yeah, I wonder that too. Where all the money went, given the fact that he did make out okay. He made a lot of money in the business.
Yeah, and he would even do it. I remember wrestling with him once for a different company, and he was trying to get me more money too. He's like, "Hey, we put on the best match. Let's get this promoter to at least get us more money." In the end, he got us a couple of free hot dogs out of it, but it was just like that's the type of guy he is. He'll try and get anything free he can.
Yeah.
Uh, I gotta ask you, as a psychologist, Sonny's been in the news again today for a blood clot issue. You mentioned about drugs and alcohol being a contributor in your line of work with a lot of people that you deal with. Unfortunately, her story is one of the saddest stories because a lot of us saw this coming. I called it that she was going to kill someone years
Mm-hmm.
before she did it. What are your thoughts on her?
No, I agree 100%. And her personality was one that she felt that she could get away with anything. I met her one time, and that was we were doing a one of those WrestleCons somewhere, and I don't do it. I don't. It was the first one I did, and we went around to a couple of different companies or stores that were selling wrestling figures and did some signings there. And she was there, and she was always very nice to the fans. But when you try to talk with her behind the scenes, she had some real issues and was really stuck on herself. And that's what you tend to see a lot of times with people with alcohol issues or issues like that. She was a very much a narcissist. And no matter how much you talk to her or send her to, if you send her to treatment or even getting locked up, she thought it would never happen to her again. So you're right. I mean, you saw it coming, you predicted it, and unfortunately, it happened. And the sad thing is, she ended up killing somebody else instead of herself. Not that I want to see her die, but that's how it is in most cases. You know, the person that's the innocent victim on the other end ends up being killed, and the perpetrator, walks away unhurt.
And the worst part about it is with people like Sonny, and I'll say it because I hope someone helps him. Just Incredible is another one
Yeah.
that has ongoing issues. They have WWE treatment covered, which a lot of average people can't spend tens of thousands a month to go to rehab. But for the people that have it paid for, I don't understand why they don't make use of it.
Well, even if they do, I mean, what it comes down to, Hannibal, it's just like if you have heart disease or you have some other kind of chronic condition, if a doctor gives you a prescription, you have to take it if you want it to work. If you go to treatment, you have to do what they tell you to do. And until you're ready to listen to somebody, you're going to continue to have these relapses happen. It's not, there's no magic pill for this. It's really about behavior and it's really about you accepting the fact that you have an issue. But, like I said, with heart disease, if the doctor gives you medication to take and you don't take it, you have a heart attack, it's on you. And the same issue happens with people like Sonny. If she went to treatment, they can talk to her blue in the face. If she doesn't use the tools they give her, they're going to go right back out in the street and relapse again.
And that just reminds me, of course, of Ric Flair, who has been in treatment. I heard him say he drank like 60 drinks before treatment and left treatment and bought a six pack and went right to the bar. And then we saw that video that came out last week. What do you think? I mean, Flair might not care at this point. He just might want to continue this until he dies. What do you think it would take for someone like Ric Flair to stop drinking? Is it possible at all? Or
I don't think so. He's going to end up dying. And again, given his age and the issues he has, yeah, it's going to kill him. But to think that somebody, and this is the kind of, you ask yourself, what kind of thinking does he have? Knowing what he was at one point and how he was looked up to by people. And I know you said he was your role model. He was somebody you followed. And again, I was impressed with Ric Flair as a kid. I didn't see a lot of NWA matches because I was in the Pennsylvania area. But when I did, he did impress me, and I did enjoy watching him. And unfortunately, for him now to go out there and brag about the drinking and to be pushing marijuana and to be the things he's doing, it's not something that I think uh, someone like Ric Flair as the next champion. I don't think that would be the legacy you want. But apparently, he just doesn't care. Like you said, he's doing what he wants to do, and that's the bottom line.
and where I looked up to him too was all the girls. I mean, this guy's had 5 wives, but you don't realize actually the consequences of when you aren't faithful and how it hurts everybody and how it can actually end up destroying your life too. And obviously that might be one of the reasons why he drinks, to probably forget about some of the issues that he probably still has to deal with, such as the death of his son, who also had a terrible
Well,
addiction problem.
yeah, he was. I mean, he had an issue long before that happened. And again, you got to ask yourself, why did he have 5 wives? Was his behavior that made those marriages break up? When you tend to see somebody who's had issues lifelong, they're also usually an accompanying mental health issue with them. I think Rick does have some mental health issues. But the drinking itself, it's a behavior. He doesn't want to change that behavior, and it does. It affects everybody around him, and yet people continue to use him, and people can. Well, he's with AEW now, but they continue to hire him, and I don't understand why. Because, and that's the problem. If you don't face consequences for your activity, you're going to continue to do it. In fact, it's almost like being rewarded. Flair brags about the drinking and how much he can drink and what he's done to people and walking around nude. I know that airplane ride from hell, or whatever it was called. I heard about that. There's no consequences. Yeah, maybe he lost his position, but somebody else picked him up. So where's the consequence for Ric Flair? Unless you begin to see that your behavior starts to affect your life that badly, um, you're going to continue doing it, and people just keep rewarding him for the bad behavior.
And I hope a guy like Buff Bagwell, who also had years of bad behavior, but it seems like he's starting to get things under control now with the help of DDP. We've seen Jake succeed. Scott Hall apparently was succeeding, but relapse again towards the time of his death. We see some success stories, but what advice could you give people as a psychologist that don't have 10 to 20,000 a month for rehab if they have alcohol or other issues about conquering them if they don't have access to some of these resources? Because it all comes down to you in the end. Because I know
Yeah,
guys like Sunny, as you said, she's been in and out of rehab. It didn't work. Scott Hall was too. So it comes down to yourself. But how can people help themselves?
it's really the bottom line, Annabelle, is just that you have to want to do it. Just like you have to want to take a medication for your heart, or you have to want to take a medication for cancer, or you want to have to go through this. You have to go through it. It's not easy. And you have to follow what people tell you. And I can tell you, I've seen some of the, and I've known people that have worked at some of the high price treatment centers. And I can tell you that the places that take people off the street and you pay nothing are just as good as those other places. In fact, I know a guy right now who was a very professional, is a professional person who went to a treatment center in Texas, paid a tremendous amount of money for it, and his curriculum, I reviewed it when he got back, was the same as was being offered by a free treatment program. So it's really about you, about making it happen. And I can tell you, he also got treated very well down in Texas. He had 3 big meals a day, exercise, the workout, exercise, a gym they had there. They had a swimming pool. So they had all these wonderful amenities for them, and it still didn't work. So I think the money involved, what you're paying for is you're paying for a name and for a a concept. But the reality is, you're going to find treatment and you're going to find success anywhere you want it. In fact, I can tell you a story about a guy I knew who was a contractor, and he failed at almost every program he was to. And he went to Betty Ford Clinic. He went to some good programs in the Boston area. And I was sitting with him one night, an outpatient. He'd come, just to, as they call it in the drug treatment business, a tune-up. And he said he found his sobriety in the dumpster. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he was an engineer. Um, he said he got so drunk one night he ended up inside of a dumpster. The next morning he got woken up by a trash truck ready to pick up the dumpster and dump it into the back. And he looked at himself and said, "What the heck are you doing here? This is horrible. I'm in here with all this filth and these empty bottles. Now I almost get killed in the back of a garbage truck." So you can find sobriety any place, but it's got to be up to you.
Good advice. One of my friends, Tom Taylor, said he once arm wrestled you at a bar. Do you remember this?
I remember Tommy Taylor. Of course I do. He's on, we used to pick on him all the time. He was a DJ at a local nightclub in Pennsylvania, and we'd go there along with a guy who was a radio disc jockey named Uncle Bob, who was probably one of the. You talk about a guy with a good mind, a sharp mind, and Bob could come up with any kind of stuff. He had one of the shock jock shows on the area, so he and I would go there every Friday night when Tommy was DJing, and we'd hassle him. We'd get on stage and hassle him and call him names, and it was part of the entertainment. But yeah, we used to ride Tommy pretty hard. But yeah, I'm ready to arm wrestle, even at my age.
And as far as Todd Gordon, who you worked with at Tri-State, any memories of him?
No, he was always behind the scenes, and I'm not sure what position he had. The guy who I dealt with mostly on Tri-State, his name was Joel Goodhart. Again, a very good man, very honest man. And I've been lucky through the years. I've met a couple of bad promoters, but I've also worked with a couple of good ones. And Joel Goodhart was one of the top. And if he promised you money, he gave you the money. His checks never bounced. He went out of his way to make things good for you if something happened. I remember I hurt my neck when I was in a match with him, but I ended up with a brachial plexus injury, and he ended up offering me money to pay for. Well, luckily, again, I had a real job and I had some good medical coverage. But that's how he was. And I was inducted recently into the New England Wrestling Hall of Fame, and Joel came all the way up from Philadelphia to the Boston area to just witness it. So he's a good man, and he was the one that I knew from Tri-State, and you couldn't ask for a better person to run shows and a better person to try to give the fans what they wanted.
I hear he might do a one-off comeback tri-state show at some point in the next few years. Hopefully that happens.
Yeah, he said that he wants me to climb back in the ring, and I can tell you in 2000 and maybe in 2005 or 2004, I did a comeback in the Fall River area, and I worked with Spike Dudley, the youngest one, and it was he and I against two other people, and I got put it out there, I got heart disease pretty bad, and I have a pacemaker, defibrillator, I had open heart surgery, I got a bunch of stents, and I climbed in the ring with that, and that night I was just standing in the ring, I started getting chest pains, and I couldn't wait to get back to the locker room area to pop a couple of nitros, and I said, "This it's over for me." You know, so if we do something in Philadelphia, we're going to have to do something and where I don't have to do anything. That's what it comes down to.
What was with the false death report of you in 2012? Did that have something to do with your heart condition?
Well, it did because what do you think ended up happening? In 2009, I had the triple bypass, and a lot of my friends knew about it, and a lot of people in the business knew about it that I was close to. And I don't talk about my health problems. You know, I don't put stuff out on Facebook or anything. Like I guess I just did now. But my father died around the same time. His name was the same as mine. He's a senior, I'm the junior. And there was a memoriam put in the paper, and I think somebody got a hold of that because he lived in the Pennsylvania area too. And I think people thought it was me, and that's when it started happening. And I remember I was sitting at work. I was at the hospital, and I get a phone call, and it's my sister, and she said, "You're alive?" I said, "Well, if I'm answering the phone, I think I am." And she slammed the phone down on me. But yeah, it was all over the place. I never knew about it until she called me.
As far as your lifts, you were a pretty strong guy. Uh, you look you look huge in the picture I used for the screenshot of this. What was your best ever bench press, deadlift, and squat? And what was your routine like? If you could just briefly go over what type of stuff you did.
I wasn't much of a squatter. Deadlifting, I didn't do much of that because I broke my tailbone in a show out in State College, Pennsylvania. I fell off the bleachers and landed on my butt and busted my tailbone, and that pretty much put an end to that. My bench was about 570. I was very strong with military presses though, and I could do reps with 405. I think the best I got in military was I think it was four. Let me see. There were four plates and 225 on it. So that's what 455 somewhere in that area. But again, I paid the price for that. I now have two fake shoulders, you know, because of the arthritis. So you know, everything has a price, and like they say, and I certainly paid it for doing that when I was younger.
And you also worked with Jules Strongbow. A lot of people confuse Chief Jules Strongbow with Chief Jay Strongbow. They both had the Native American gimmick. I think they were both behind the scenes uh, in various companies at different points. How was working with Jules, and what is the difference between Jules and Jay for the people that get them confused?
Well, Jules is a real Indian, number one. His real name is Frank Huntington, and he belongs to a tribe out in the Midwest. Jules was was an Italian, so I mean, I think that took away. Jay was an Italian, so I think that took away from knowing he's the real Indian. But I think Jay had a little more charisma than Jules did. Jules never really got over in WWF like Jay did, but as far as working with me, he certainly was a great worker. I love working with Jules, and he was a very down to earth guy that actually would help if he needed help with something. He was there to do it, and he didn't put his hand out for money, which was pretty rare in his business.
You mentioned working with Rick Martel. Why do you think he's not in the WWE Hall of Fame yet? Former AWA champion. He was in Strike Force. He had a great gimmick with the model. He's one of the strange ones why they're not in there. Great wrestler.
I don't know. I just know that, yeah, again, it was, you heard the saying, I hate to say it, a night off, but certainly it was with him. The first night I worked with him, the first match in London, Ontario, you don't know what to expect from somebody. And yet I went out there and didn't feel a thing. He was again, great worker, went by what we talked about, did the finish we talked about. Why he's not in the Hall of Fame, I don't know. I'm sure there's something behind it. It's probably political. Not sure what it is, but based on what I know about McMahon and some of the stories about him, something happened, and there were politics involved somewhere, or he upset somebody somewhere, and that's why he's not in it.
Who was the most famous person you would say you've met in the wrestling business?
I think it depends on who you see as a role model, and I would certainly say Bruno Sammartino. As far as I'm concerned, I never looked at people that way as being famous. To me, they were doing a job just like I was doing a job. But in terms of, again, Bruno was important to me because of how I felt about him growing up. And so the first time I met him, I got to tell you, Hannibal, I was intimidated, and very few guys intimidated me. Not because they think I'm a tough guy. I'm far from a tough guy. But because what he meant to me in my life, and finally getting to meet the guy, yeah, that was a great moment for me. So fame, I don't know, but in terms of how it made me feel, it had to be Bruno Sammartino.
Do you have a favorite match or most memorable match over the years?
I guess my favorite match for a series of matches I have with Larry Winters in Tri-State, and also outside of Tri-State as well. We must have worked together, I would say, hundreds of times, and always enjoyed the matches with him. In fact, we had the big feud at Tri-State. So it was Larry. Unfortunately, left us very early, very young, of a heart attack. But he had to be probably one of the favorite guys I had in some of the most memorable matches I had with Larry.
And we were talking about women earlier. Here's a couple of pictures where you look a lot different than you did now, but she was looking stunning there. I don't know how Kevin ever pulled that off.
Hate to say it, but she always did. Yeah, Kevin certainly got the good end of the deal there. That's for sure.
Where can people follow you if they want to look you up? I know you got a Facebook page.
That's basically it. Like I said, it's not that I'm disillusioned with wrestling. I just think today's wrestling is not something I want to be involved in. I'm not bitter about it. Yeah, I wish I made the money that's out there today. But the character I had, the Mad Dog Drake character, was very much like, I suppose, the George Steele character. If the if the territories were still alive, it would work. But the character I had, you can only stay in a place so long. Once you see the act, it gets old. So I just backed out of like I said, when I left it, I just backed out of it. I let it go. But I'm starting to get a little bit more interested in it again because of people actually wanting to see the old school wrestling again, actually wanting to let go of what we see today and appreciate some of the stuff that was big back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I'm getting a lot more requests for people to do wrestle cons, which I probably won't do any anyway. I don't like them. And but I guess the best way to reach me is just go to my Facebook page.
Yeah, I remember when AEW first came back, or first came in, they said they were going to go old school, and they
Yeah.
ended up being more new school than WWE. So a lot of people like me will just go back and watch the stuff from the 80s and 90s rather than watch current product.
Yeah,
It's too bad. I hope another league comes around someday that is more traditional.
yeah. Do you really think that would work today, Hannibal? Given the fact that we know so much, or fans know so much today?
It would be difficult because you would need everybody on board from the same company with the same ideas, and you'd need them to prevent at least make their characters believable and not give out all the information, which is hard to do with social media today. But you can make people believe still if an angle is done well enough, but it's very rare these days.
Yeah, but like you said, everybody has to be on board with that. I do know. I
Yeah.
see this with Tony Khan, where he does the what do they call it after the show, the scrum or whatever
The
they call it.
scrum, and they do it in WWE now too, where they just blatantly break kayfabe.
Yeah, it's horrible. But again, I always go back and say back to the magician thing. Could you imagine a magician like David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear, or could you imagine after the show going out there and telling people how it's done? He'd never sell another ticket. So I don't know why they do these things, but I guess they think they have to do it today, given the fan base.
Yeah, I noticed some of the wrestlers like Edge and even Roman Reigns, when they're put out there, will kayfabe more than others like Sami Zayn. I've heard him say right after a match, "Well, we know what this is, what we're doing out here."
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
this is the same show. And it's like a lot of fans don't. A lot of fans just don't want to hear it. They'd
right.
rather that you kayfabe.
You're slapping people in the face, and that's what it comes down to. You want to go out there, you do want to let go of that, you do want this police suspended, and yet they come out and they keep slapping you in the face. So I'm surprised that they continue to have the following they have. But I guess you can get away with kids, young kids. But when you reach a certain point, I don't think it has the same appeal that it once did.
Well, I just read before we started this, AEW got their lowest rating since June 2020. So obviously, I mean, the thing with Tony Khan where he did that neck bracing, it'd be one thing if he actually sold it, but he's doing these NFL things like with a big smile on his face, looking like he's not in pain at all. So I don't think it's worked overall because we're seeing them hit new lows
And then I
in
just
ratings.
right, so, and I just seen that they just did a match with Orange Cassidy where he was given a pile driver on a set of steel stairs and popped right back up again. So how is that believable? How do you do that when you got Tony Khan walking around with the neck brace on, and Orange Cassidy pops up from a pile driver on a set of steel steps? It's just it amazes me.
Yeah, it makes us kind of, and then they wonder why we get upset when we call it fake sometimes, or people call it fake. It's like you guys admit that it is, and you don't try and hide it. Or I even saw Seth Rollins. There was something that came out a week ago going off at people that are calling it fake. He got taken down by a fan a
Yeah,
couple of years ago. So how are we not supposed to think it's fake?
I know, and like you said, they're out there with that scrum. Actually, the opponents sitting together, talking about what a great show they had, a great match they had. Yeah, yeah, it's that part of it's over. And no matter how much they cry about it and wanting to make it seem like it was in the 70s and 80s, it's not going to happen.
Patrick from Wind Gap, Pennsylvania
Yeah.
says hello. You
Hey,
know
Pat,
him?
how are you? Yeah, I hope your health is doing better, Patrick.
Last question, and I know you probably can't talk about this in too much detail because of confidentiality agreements, but I actually worked in the similar domain as you, but more as security in group homes with developmentally delayed adults, or some would call them psychotic with violent tendencies. And I
Mm.
witnessed some pretty wild things that people wouldn't believe. Do you have any stories from your practice? What would be like? I mean, I don't know what you could talk about or just in general vaguely say, but like of a really unbelievable situation that you're aware of that may have taken place.
Well, not as much unbelievable, but the fact that, especially working in the addictions field, of how far people with addictions will go to get high. We had people that would drink hand sanitizer because at the time, I know they've done away with this now. At the time, it was 40% alcohol, which means it was 80 proof. So they were drinking hand sanitizer. They would make concoctions with nutmeg, and um, they would make their own wine, but putting bread and water and Kool Aid or something else into a bag and put it on a heater. And all this stuff is ends up being poisonous. But again, they're looking for the high more than thinking about what it's going to do to their health. So that they were the things we always watched for, and those were the things that it's unbelievable to what extent people will go to get high.
Yeah, that's sad, and hopefully, people like Sonny out there, maybe someone watching this will hear some of the stuff you said today, and maybe take it to heart. And I appreciate your wrestling stories. Nice talking to you. I'll let you close this off with whatever you want to tell the fans.
I just want to tell the fans thank you for everything during my years of wrestling. Um, I loved you guys. Without you, I would not have been able to perform. I loved everything. Being with you with the fans. So without the fans that believed in the hardcore, or not the hardcore, but the old school wrestling, we wouldn't have had it. So I certainly appreciate the fans for everything they've done for me for my career, and I just thank you from the bottom of my heart. That's it.